Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to start hearing evidence from the London Fire Brigade in relation to training. Yes, Mr. Keir.
So may I call Peter Groves?
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Groves.
Morning.
Yes, you can take off the dreaded mask.
Morning.
I understand you're going to affirm, is that right?
I am, yeah.
Could you then please read the words on the screen?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now do sit down.
Thank you.
Get comfortable.
Fine,
All right?
thank you.
Yes, when you're ready, Mr. Keir.
Thanks, sir. Would you please confirm your name for the record?
Peter Groves.
Good morning, Mr. Groves. Before we start today, I should sort of make 3 points. First of all, if at any stage you require a break, please say so. That's not a problem. Secondly, if any stage my questions are unclear or unduly long, please say so, and I'll try and ask you a proper, short question. Thirdly, if you wouldn't mind keeping your voice up whilst giving evidence, that's so that the transcriber can capture everything you say and capture it accurately.
Okay.
Now, you have made 3 statements as a result of the Grenfell Tower fire. First, a Rule 9 witness statement dated the 18th of April, which can be 2019, which can be found at LFB 000555126. And if we turn over the page to page 2, we see your signature. Can you confirm that's your witness statement whilst we're waiting for that?
Yes, that is my witness statement.
Thank you. Exhibited to that witness statement.
Well, let's just, we've now got page 2 up.
Is that your signature?
It is, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, exhibited to that witness statement at PG/1 is a report entitled How Training Works, dated the 16th of April 2019, and that can be found at LFB 000555127. Is that report?
It is, yes.
And were you the author?
I was.
And was that report written for the purposes of this inquiry?
It was, yes.
Secondly, you provided a second statement to this inquiry dated the 5th of March 2020. That can be found at LFB 00102138. Is that your second statement?
It is.
And if we could go to page 71 in that document, is that your signature?
It is.
Thank you. Thirdly, you prepared a statement for the Metropolitan Police dated the 5th of February 2020, and that can be found at Met 000711103. And can you confirm that's that particular statement?
Yes.
And it's your electronic signature, I think, in the bottom left-hand corner of each page.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, have you read each of those statements recently?
I have.
And can you confirm that the contents of the statements are true?
They are true.
And can you confirm that the contents of the report at PG1 is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I can confirm that.
And you're happy for those 3 statements and that report to be taken as your evidence to this inquiry?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Groves, I'd like to start by asking you about your roles and responsibilities whilst employed by the London Fire Brigade. Is it right that you were employed by the LFB from November 1987 onwards?
That's right.
And that you're now retired?
That's right.
And when did you retire?
Retired 31st of May this year.
Thank you. And your career in the LFB's training department started in 2009, is that right?
That's right.
Now, if we can go to your second witness statement, LFB 00102138/12, and we look at paragraph 7, you say there in the opening lines this: from 2009 to 2012, I was the project manager for Future Options for Training project and reported to the Director of Operational Resilience and Training. Now, were you employed as a project manager at this time? Was this a responsibility you took on in addition to a pre-existing role?
No, this was my sole role during that time period.
The Future Options for Training project ultimately resulted in operational training, apart from control room training, being outsourced to Babcock Training Limited. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, but in addition to operational training, there was also training for non-operational member of staff other than control staff, so it'd be office-based staff.
Thank you. Now, if we stay in paragraph 7 of this statement, which goes on to say from the 5th line downwards this: from 2012 to 2014, I was the head of training, assurance and business relationships and reported to the head of human resources. Between 2012 and 2016, the head of human resources had corporate responsibility for training. Now, first of all, was James Dalgleish the head of human resources until 2015?
He was.
Did the Human Resources Department later come to be called the Training and Development Department?
It was the actual Human Resources Department split into two. So you had a Training and Professional Development Department, and then you had a People Services Department.
Now, apart from the name change, were the training elements of the functions and responsibilities altered?
Not at that time, no.
Did they come later to be altered?
Yes, following
When?
a People Services review, they were changed, yes.
And when was that?
Around towards the end of 2018, beginning of 2019.
And what were the elements of the defining changes that were made in 2018?
So the changes were that I was responsible for organisational development. That was moved into the People Services function. And the station-based maintenance of operational skills was previously under fire stations remit. That was moved into my remit from 2019.
Thank you. Between 2012 and 2016, did the Human Resources and later Training Department fall within the Directorate of Operations, Resilience and Training?
It did.
Thank you. And am I also right to assume that Mr. Dalgleish in your department reported to Gary Reason, the Director of Operations, Resilience and Training?
He did.
Thank you. Now, can we turn to your Met statement and page 20 of that, which is at Met 0071103/20, and in particular the bottom paragraph on that page. Now, there you say this: at the time of the Lacknell House recommendations, so that's 2013, there were 3 people responsible for training. Training was split into 2. The Training Assurance and Business Relationship arm, which I headed. The other half of this was the Learning and Development Strategy, headed by DAC Kevin Hughes. If we go over the page, there was a head of HR, James Dalgleish. There were around 5 deputies. My responsibility was around the contract and assurance. Kevin was responsible for the commissioning arm of it. Now, rising out of that, in 2013, so the time of the Lacknell House recommendations, what was the role and function of the Training, Assurance and Business Relationship team?
So in 2013, if there had been any packages that were produced related to Lacknell, which wasn't the case, but if they had been, then it would have been the responsibility of my department to assure the training, to go and witness the training, to ensure that the trainers were delivering the packages according to what had been agreed between the LFB and Babcock.
Now, mindful of your answer there that you assured the training.
Yes.
Can you help us? What was the role of the Learning and Development Strategy team?
So the Learning and Development Strategy team were responsible for project managing the training. So there was Tcap documents, which training commission and alteration process. And they project managed from the start to end, liaising with the commissioning department and Babcock. Then once that training had got to a point where the LFB was ready to sign that off, then at that time I had some auditors, assurers within my department who would go and sit in a classroom, if it was classroom based or practical, and they would sit and watch the training to see whether the learning objectives had been met and the training objectives.
Thank you. Would that strategy team have been responsible for recommending new training or requesting changes to existing training?
No, predominantly changes to training would come from commissioning departments, and primarily that would have been ops policy and assurance, who were the main commissioning department.
Thank you. So that everyone is clear, was the Learning and Development Strategy Team sometimes also known as the LFB's Training Commissioning Department?
Correct.
Now, if we can go back, and apologies for jumping around your evidence, if we can go back to your second witness statement to the inquiry and page 12, which can be found at LFB 00102138/12, and we see back at paragraph 7, if we can look at the final 2 lines of that paragraph, you say this: between 2015 and 2016, I was the head of learning and development and HR strategy and reported to the head of human resources. Does that mean that you, by this stage, had assumed DAC Hughes's previous role?
Correct.
And if so, were you then responsible for commissioning new training, or did that lie with the commissioning heads of department?
I was responsible for project managing the training, but the specification and commissioning of training was led by the commissioning departments.
Thank you. Now, if we can stay in the statement but move on to paragraph 8, you say this, that from January 2016 to April 2018, my role was head of development and training. I reported to the Director of Safety and Assurance. Now, it seems here that the department's name had changed from Human Resources to Development and Training. Is that right?
Correct.
And that the Directorate's name had changed from Operations, Resilience and Training to Safety and Assurance. Is that also correct?
That's right, yes.
Who was the Director of Safety and Assurance during your tenure as Head of Development and Training?
I believe it was initially James Dalglish in an interim role. Then it became Danny Cotton, then Steve Apter.
And is it right to assume for these purposes that Danny Cotton was the Head of Safety Insurance for the bulk of 2016 and that she was succeeded by Mr. Apter in December 2016?
Correct.
Thank you. And so it flows from that you held the role of Head of Development and Training at the time of the Grenfell fire in June 2017.
Yes.
Did you remain in that position until your retirement in May of this year?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, having set out your background and the various name changes of relevant departments, can we now turn to training processes and, first of all, the methodology that was adopted by the LFB? And for this purpose, I'd like you to turn to your How Training Works report, which can be found at LFB 00055127. And if we go to page 3. Now, you see on the screen there paragraph 1.1, which opens with these words. This document provides an overview of how the Brigade assesses and specifies its training needs and how, in conjunction with Babcock Training Limited, hereafter BTL, training is designed, delivered and evaluated. Now, this report is dated April 2019, but my questions are going to be directed as to what this state of affairs was at the time of the fire in June 2017. Now, do you accept that the LFB had ultimate responsibility for provision of training to its staff?
I do.
Do you also accept that no training package could be provided to its employees without it being approved and signed off by the LFB?
I agree.
Thank you. Now, if we can stay on this page but go down to paragraph 1.2, you say there that the document has been structured, in the second line, has been structured around the training cycle using the ADDIE model, that's capital A, capital D, D-I-E model. And then you set out and explain what that model consists of. First of all, to assess and analyse needs. Secondly, to develop learning objectives. Thirdly, design and develop the training solutions. Fourthly, implement the design. And finally, evaluate effectiveness. Now, when was that ADDIE model first adopted by the LFB?
The ADDIE model has always been in existence for all the time that I was in a learning and development post.
So since 2009 at least?
Yes.
And did the LFB use this model, just to clarify the point, at the time of the Grenfell fire?
it did.
Would the LFB be involved in all of these 5 stages of the training cycle, though perhaps to varying degrees?
Yes.
Now, if we can flesh out matters and turn to the first stage of the ADDIE model, which is to assess and analyse needs. And if we can go further into this document on page 9 and paragraph 3.6. You say there this: training needs are identified by heads of department who are best placed to identify whether training is required to enable their staff to discharge their areas of responsibility and meet the organisation's need. These requirements are subsequently collated to form a corporate statement of training requirements, SOTR. Now, is it right to say that while your department was primarily responsible for the provision of training, the LFB training needs were identified elsewhere in the organisation, i.e. by the commissioning heads of department?
Yes, predominantly, yeah. They would have responded to some changes in either legislation, policy or procedures, yes.
Did your department, so the training department itself, have any role in identifying areas of weakness or gaps in the provision of existing training?
At the time of the fire or subsequently?
All my questions are directed to the state of affairs before the fire.
Right, at that point, no.
And so you're reliant upon prompts from elsewhere within the LFB?
Yes.
Was the training department's main role, therefore, to collate training needs and requirements and to organise the process by which those needs were met?
Yes.
If we can stay on this page, but go down to paragraph 3.9, you say there that the SOTR, is there another way of pronouncing that, or would you call it the SOTR?
I call it the SOTR.
So the Statement of Training Requirements production commences in April of each year. Historical SOTR data, where possible, covering the past 5 years, is sent to all heads of department, and they are invited to provide their training requirements for the forthcoming year. Where required, this is followed up with a meeting. Once all training requirements have been submitted, the data is collected by TMPD, which I think stands for Training Professional Development Department.
Yes.
The collated data comprises requirements for training courses that are on the course guide and new courses that are currently in the process of being created. Now, does that process amount to the LFB's heads of departments indicating how many places they require on the LFB's various training programmes?
That's part of it, yes, but also they will identify new pieces of training that they think need to be commissioned in the forthcoming year as a result of either corporate policies, plans, mayoral plans. So horizon scanning, what training needs they predict will be coming forward in the next 12 to 18 months.
Thank you. Can we just put this document down for a moment and go to another one, which is at LFB 000-67786, which is a report by Ribbon Star entitled Independent Review of Training, Final Report, and it's dated the 11th of September 2019. First of all, are you familiar with this report?
I am.
Why did the LFB commission this report?
The commissioner at the time commissioned the report. I believe it was for an independent review into how training was being delivered, specifically around operational training, and to get independent view to see whether there could be some improvements in the way that training was structured and delivered within the organisation.
Now, we're going to explore the contents of this report as we go through your evidence, but for present purposes, could we turn to page 31? And the first paragraph on that page. And the following is said in relation to the statement of training process, of training requirement process that we've just sort of touched on. It is the belief of many of the stakeholders interviewed that the default position is to simply request the same number of courses as requested in previous years, without a proper analysis of actual training need within each department. Would you agree with that conclusion?
I would definitely agree with that conclusion for the majority of the years. Towards the end of the time that I worked with the LFB, that did change. But yeah, there was a tendency to carry forward without too much analysis.
The position changed. Were you the driver for that change, and what did that change involve?
I would say it was a mixture of myself driving and also this report. So what we did is far more challenging. We would sit down with the heads of service and ask them to look at, to challenge them and say, in effect, what you're doing is just calling forward what you've done in previous years. And we would have the data available to say, you've requested so many places on a course previously and you haven't utilised those. We know that you've got some new things coming in your business plan. Why aren't they included in your request for training in the forthcoming years?
Were there any particular departments within the LFB that required greater initiative to think about their needs compared to other departments?
Yes.
Which ones were they?
They were predominantly those departments that served non-uniformed staff, so office-based staff.
Now, if we can go back to your How Training Works report, and that can be found at LFB 000555127/9. And if we can look at paragraph 3.7, there you explain this. The Operational Policy and Assurance Department may also commission training interventions as an outcome of a new or revised policy or procedure. My question arising from that is this: could other departments also commission new training or make alterations to existing training packages?
Yes, they could.
And there was no limit on that?
No.
Would training interventions be commissioned via the Tcap process?
Yes.
Now, first of all, you touched on this in an earlier answer. Tcap stands for Training, Commissioning and Alterations Process. Is that right?
It is, yes.
Now, we can flesh out for everyone what that process involves. And if, for that purpose, can we look at your second witness statement, which is at LFB 00102138/22. And if we can look at paragraph 32 in particular, you describe the Tcap process thus: a training requirement could be identified by a commissioning department within the Brigade or by Babcock. Regardless of who identifies the training requirement, the Tcap is followed. Up to and including June 2017, once a training requirement had been identified, a Tcap form was completed. This would then have been approved to be taken forward by the Tcap working group, which included members of the Training and Development Department, Contract Management Group, and Babcock. The request was then submitted to the Contract Performance Monitoring Board, CPMB, for approval. Now, bearing that description in mind, can we now look at some of the elements that are set out in that particular passage I've just quoted? Now, you say that, and I quote, once a training requirement had been identified, a Tcap form was completed. Now, can we look at an example of such a form, which is at PG 10 and can be found at LFB 00102235? Now, as can be seen there on the front page, this is the Tcap form for the training package entitled Enhanced Incident Command Training based on LACNL Inquest Rule 43 recommendations. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, was that the form that was completed once a training requirement had been identified following the coroner's recommendations after the LACNL inquest?
So there was a form prior to this, which is a training request form, which really sort of just laid out the sort of bones in sense of what training felt needed to be commissioned and why, and then that led into the Tcap form.
Thank you. And just so that we can fix people in the evidence, can we go to LFB 003759? It's a post-GTI example, I think.
Yes.
But that's the form you're referring to there.
Correct.
And just for the avoidance of doubt, that form was the format and structure that existed before the fire.
Yes, I can't say 100%, but yes, I mean, there might be some minor...
But in its essentials.
But yes, yeah.
Now, looking back at it, who was responsible, first of all, for initiating or completing the training request form?
So that would be the commissioning department.
And who would be responsible for completing the Tcap form that we looked at before this document?
So the Tcap form would be led by project managers within the Training and Professional Development Department in close consultation with the commissioning departments.
And would it be fair to say that the individuals in your department would have put flesh on the bones that were provided by the training request form?
That would be fair.
And thinking through the complexities and the practicalities of substance and implementation?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, if we can go back to your witness statement, LFB 00102138/22, and if we look at line 4 of paragraph 32, you say this in relation to the Tcap form. This would then have been approved to be taken forward by the Tcap working group. My question is this: whose responsibility was it to approve a Tcap form?
Sorry, just to clarify, do you mean the actual content of the form before it went forward to the meeting, or whether it was that training was agreed and would become part of, to be developed?
Both, actually, if you can, for the sake of completeness.
Yes, sure. So in terms of making sure that the form was fit for purpose and it had been completed fully and accurately, that would be a project manager within the Training and Professional Development Department. In terms of once the Tcap had been completed and it would have gone to the CPMB meeting. It would have been introduced by a member from the Training and Professional Development Department, and in essence recommending that this training be commissioned and budget etc. was made available so that training could be completed.
Thank you. Now, you say in your witness statement that the Tcap form would be, quotes, taken forward by the Tcap working group, which included members of the Training and Development Department, Contract Management Group and Babcock. What was the role of that working group?
So the working group was to collate all of the new Tcaps, to have checked with the stakeholders, which predominantly would have been the commissioning department, and ordinarily the head of fire stations or their deputy, because predominantly the training that was being commissioned was being prepared for frontline fire operational officers. So whatever solutions that were being recommended, we had to make sure that it didn't have a detrimental impact on the front line. And so the head of fire stations or their nominated deputy were happy with that solution before it went forward.
When you say detrimental effect on the front line, what are you seeking to encapsulate by that phrase?
So if we were... I don't like to use the word training burden, but it is one that is used time and time again. To me, it has a negative connotation. But if you think about the amount of training that is available throughout the year that already exists, and then you look at the new pieces of training that are being added, what impact would that have on the front line in terms that you couldn't release everybody to do all of that training at that time? So that could lead to prioritisation.
Thank you. And in an answer just before that last question, you referred to the commissioning department. Was that department represented on the Tcap working group?
Yes.
Who were the other members of the Tcap working group?
So predominantly it would have been a representative for Training and Professional Department. It would have been someone from Babcock, someone from the Contract Management Group, the Commissioning Department and fire stations.
Thank you. So when you say fire stations, clearly not all of them, how would their representation be determined?
It was invariably the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for fire stations.
Now, moving on to what else you said in paragraph 32, you referred to the CPMB, so that's the Contract Performance and Monitoring Board. At what stage was the CPMB approval sought?
So once the Tcap had been, at this time, once the Tcap had been produced and that the commissioning department was happy with it. The department was happy that all the form had been completed appropriately, and the head of fire stations is also happy with it. It would then be at that point it would be presented to the CPMB meeting.
Thank you. Just going back slightly, would Dave, looking at the fire stations representative, would Dave Brown, as head of fire stations, have signed off on all Tcaps, or at least his deputy?
I couldn't say that 100% because some Tcaps were signed off by Dave Brown's deputy, if you see what I mean. So there would have been signed off by someone within the fire stations department. Predominantly, they were signed off by the Deputy Assistant Commissioner.
So people like Mr. Brown?
Mr. Fenton.
Mr. Fenton, thank you. Now, would the role of the CPM be to scrutinise the substance of the proposed training package, or if that's not the case, what would their role be?
Their role was, they wouldn't have scrutinised the content of the training package. Their role was to look at the training commitment for the year, whether we had sufficient funds available to add these additional pieces of training to the training plan, and whether if there was a need to look for additional funds, they would direct the route in which that could be progressed, or would prioritise training in the sense that they might determine that some courses were reduced delegate numbers. So it's really about managing the size of the training load.
Thank you. We'll come on to the financial aspects in later questions.
Yep.
Can you help in broad idea who sat on the board?
I'm going to struggle a bit with this, to be honest with you, because it did change its name in many times. But at that time, I believe it was the chair was James Dalgleish. Then there would have been representatives from Babcock. Do you want names or roles?
No, not particularly, just an idea of the seniority of attendees primarily.
So it would have been Babcock's contract director, would have been their head of design and development. On the LFB side, it would have been myself, would have been my training commission and delivery manager, would have been the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for fire stations, and sometimes you would have representation from the LFB's Health and Safety Lead.
Thank you. Now, can you remember any instances where a training need had been identified by a commissioning department, but the board had not approved that at all?
Yes, those occasions did occur. Predominantly, they were not in the arena of operational training. They would have been training for support function roles. The tendency with requests coming from non-operational colleagues, it tended to want what you would call the gold standard, in the sense of they would have they'd have gone out, done some scanning themselves, they would invariably come forward and would recommend a provider. So, we would say, no, focus on the learning outcomes and the objectives. It's not your role to come here with a training solution.
Thank you. Now, just going back to paragraph 32, which is on the screen, I think it's broadly 8 lines down from the top. You there refer to stakeholder group meetings. Were stakeholder groups different to the Tcap working group?
Yes.
Who were they?
So the stakeholder group meetings fed into the Tcap, and you would have had the project manager from the Training Professional Development Department, and you would have had a representative from Babcock, usually the designer, who had been nominated to design that piece of training. And then you would have had a representative from Mr. Fenton's department.
Okay. Now, if we can go back to the How Training Works report, which can be found at LFB 000555127/9. And if you look at paragraph 3.5, which is at the top of that page, you explain at the top that there are, quotes, internal factors which may lead to the generation of a training requirement or direct the head of department when specifying a training need. And you've set out below that 4 bullet points, which are operational improvement, process information, quality assurance, audits of training courses, training course evaluations, and corporate strategies and plans. Now, just looking at the first bullet point, operational improvement process information, is it correct that this would have been referred to as a DOT or a DIOT, the Dynamic Intelligent Operational Training Process at the time of the fire?
Yes, DIOT. We
DIOT.
called it. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. And the information gathered via the DIOT process would be considered then by the Operational Directorates Coordination Board, or ODCB.
Yes.
Thank you. We'll be exploring ODCB and the DIOT processes with another witness, but for the time being, is it right to say this, that ODCB could request new training as well as changes to existing training?
ODCB would direct into predominantly around operational news training. Yeah.
So to that extent, the answer is yes.
Yes,
And then your department would work with Babcock to implement that.
that's right.
Now, if we can now go to your Mps Witness Statement, which is at Met 0007103/5, and really the final paragraph on that page, you say this: my team's responsibility is to sit down with all heads of service to reflect on what they have had over the last 5 years, look at the London Safety Plan, look at the strategies, the aims for the next 3 to 5 years, what is required by staff in terms of training, but also what is the corporate responsibility. Now, looking at that paragraph, are you referring here to the training department's work as part of the Statement of Training Requirements process, or some other separate and distinct process?
That's the Statement of Training Requirement process.
Would you be able to give the panel an idea of how often you would discuss with the commissioning heads of departments their training needs?
Yes. So we would meet usually around June time every year with all heads of service, and we would talk them through the process and explain how we were going to gather the training requirement for that year, what their role was in determining that requirement. Then invariably the head of service would then nominate someone within their department that we would liaise with, so who had more day-to-day dealings with the training requirements, so they could quantify that more clearly. Then we would collate that training requirement. If it was very clear in terms of what they had requested, then we would go back and confirm that it'd be a confirmatory meeting with them. Others, you would go back repeatedly to just sort of say, these numbers are substantially higher or lower than previous years. Going back to my point earlier around looking at corporate plans and strategies, have you considered that this new piece of equipment's coming in legislation? I would imagine that the numbers would increase in these areas when you're looking for new equipment or legislation coming. So it's a challenge process. It could, for some, be backwards and forwards 3 or 4 times.
But in essence, the principal meeting was annual,
Yes,
in June,
yes,
and then the subsidiary meetings followed from that.
yes.
Thank you. Now, in the particular paragraph we've looked at in your Met statement, you use the verb reflect. How would the training department reflect on what a particular department had had over the last 5 years by way of training?
Yep. So we collated performance data for the previous training year and back to 2012, and we could even precede that to when the LFB delivered the training themselves. We would look at all of the courses that were on the course guide, and we could show them the number of delegates that they had requested for each of those courses, and in turn, how many people had attended those courses, and how many that. Throughout the year, you could do something called a delegate place change. So if a department decided that they wanted it up or decrease the training requirement, we would also have that detail, and we'd include all that data when we sat down with them.
Thank you. And just flowing from that, how often would heads of departments and the training department identify the need for a new training course as part of the SOTR process? If you're able to give a meaningful answer to that question.
I would say in terms of the collation process for SOTR, that was very rare. Most of the requests for new training was done throughout the year. It wasn't necessarily done as part of the collation process.
Was there a qualitative element to the reflection process? I.e., you're looking at the quality of the standard of training that was provided as opposed to how much, to how many people and how frequently?
Predominantly quantitative. There were occasions where I can think of one course in particular, where there were discussions around why are you requesting this course again when we know that there has been feedback that this course needs to change and it should go through the course review process.
Would any qualitative points be made in the annual meeting with the commissioning heads of department, or would there be less formal ways of communicating problems with the quality of a particular course?
Yeah, there would be project boards for each of the training curricula throughout the year, and so the information that came from evaluations from either delegates, managers or Babcock trainers themselves, those were fed into the monthly project board meetings.
Can we now turn to a separate document, at LFB 000-42179, and it's a document entitled LDS, which I think is Learning and Development Strategy, Team One-to-Ones, August 2013. And we have it up there on the screen, and you'll see in the box at the top and centre of that page that it concerned Operational Procedures Department.
Yes.
And the attendees from Operational Procedures were Peter Cowap, I think Jim Acord, and Rachel Weatheridge was the representative from the Learning Development Strategy team. Is that right?
Yes.
How regularly did the training department have these one-to-one meetings with other departments?
This was before my time, but I know that they were predominantly with the Operational Procedures Department. They were the major commissioning department, and it was felt that there was a need to sit down with that department because they were commissioning the vast, the majority of the training.
And so you say it's before your time. Did you discontinue this type of meeting when you became head of the department?
I did, and then I reinstated it at a later stage.
Why did you reinstate?
I reinstated because I felt that there was a breakdown in communication between the commissioning department and the training department, and at times the commissioning department going direct to Babcock rather than through my department.
We'll come on to communications later on in your examination. One point which arises going through these documents is why did individual departments not simply pass their training requirements directly to Babcock without the training department acting as a go-between?
That would be a contractual issue and a budgetary issue. If departments had gone straight to Babcock, then there would have been no sense of how large the training requirement was and whether the organisation could afford it. And also in terms of, I think I mentioned earlier, some departments were going with their solutions and had come forward with ideas for training to be subcontracted to other organisations, and that didn't fit contractually. And also there was the issue around the size of the training budget. And
so, put differently, you were a necessary link in the chain to ensure overview both of provision and to ensure some financial management. Is that a fair summary?
That's fair.
Now, could we go back to your Mps Witness Statement, which is at Met 0071103/11. And if we look at the third paragraph down from the top, you said there are some Babcock-initiated Tcaps, but they are rare. First question is, how rare? Are you able to give the panel a steer? Would it be once a year, once every 3 years, once every 5 years?
Yeah.
What order?
My memory is that it was rare to the point of it was once.
And once during your time as head of department, or once in your time in the training department?
From 2012.
And can you remember what was the substance of the Babcock-initiated Tcap?
It was related to mass decontamination training.
Okay, thank you. Can you help us to why Babcock-initiated Tcaps were such a rarity?
I'm surmising here, so I don't know for definite, but I would imagine Babcock weren't always as creative or proactive as we would like them to be. And I've had numerous conversations with their contract director, and not long before I left had similar conversations again, that we want them to, they are our training provider. We want you to come forward with new ideas, use new technology. They had experienced cases in the past where they had put up new creative and innovative ideas, and the LFB had either rejected them in full or partially rejected them. And I think as Babcock became slightly passive, and I was encouraging them to come forward. You can submit 100 things, and if you get 2 out of them, then it's important to do that. It's like the person who is creating something for the first time. You will always have knockbacks, but it's important. Your role is to come up with new ideas and new training solutions.
I don't mean this critically at all, Mr. Groves, but it seems if your endeavours to encourage Babcock to show more initiative were fruitless. Is that a fair summary of the position?
I would say that is fair.
We'll come on to this in more detail, and apologies, a bit of a diversion at this stage, but the impression arising from the documents is that the LFB tended to prescribe the subject matter and the content of training without much contribution from Babcock on those matters. From the general level, is that a fair impression to take?
I think yes, that is a fair impression. I want to add to that, though, if that's okay.
Please do.
The LFB some departments would tend to come with those solutions, as I mentioned earlier, and they would say, this is what I want. And the discussions we would have with them is, you're not a learning and development professional. Your job is to tell us what you want someone to learn, what behaviour you want to change, what skill you want them to acquire. It's the training provider to come forward and take what your outcome is, and they will produce a range of solutions to which you will be involved with, and you ultimately will sign off. So it's not for you to come as a operational member of staff to tell a learning development professional how to do something. A learning development professional wouldn't tell you how to fight a fire.
Thank you. That's very useful. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Groves. Well, as I say, we'll come on to the minutiae of that later on. Now, I've come to the end of my questions with respect to stage 1 of the ADDI process. I'm now going to move on to stage 2, which was development of learning objectives. And if we can go back to the How Training Works report, which is at LFB 000555127/4. And if I could ask you to look at paragraph 1.4, you summarise the second stage of development of learning objectives thus: after it has been determined that there is a legitimate training need, learning objectives are developed. There are 2 kinds of objectives from 2 perspectives used in training, namely, learning performance objective. This is a statement of the performance. knowledge, skill and or behaviour that is desired after the training has been conducted. Learners are told what these are at the beginning of a training session and are reinforced throughout the delivery. Training objective. This is a statement of what the trainer needs to accomplish during the training session. Who would be responsible for identifying and developing these learning objectives? Would it lie with the commissioning heads of department or elsewhere?
So the learning and performance objective would definitely be the commissioning department. In terms of the training objective, then that's Babcock, because it's their trainer, Paul.
Thank you. And if we could return for these purposes to the exemplar Tcap form we looked at earlier, which is at LFB 00102235/4. We see at the grey box at the top of the page says Stage 1 Tcap development, and underneath in the top left-hand corner in bold it says basic information. And then the boxes thereafter set out the Tcap title, the commissioning officer, the client, the course details, and the Tcap stakeholder group members. Now, as part of this process, can you help us? What were the respective roles of the commissioning officer and the client?
So the commissioning officer would have been that department who were either responsible for the policy, the procedure, or had within their business plan a change to a piece of equipment, or were aware of a change in legislation. So that's the commissioning department. You'll have to refresh me what the second one is.
Sorry, apologies. The client.
Yes. Oh, so the client, in effect, could still be the commissioning department, or the person who is going to use the training.
Okay.
So predominantly, yet again, would be fire stations.
Staying with the form, but turning over the page to page 5. We see in the first box on that page, we are told who is providing the subject matter expertise, or SME. And in this case, it was the group manager, LFB Instant Command. Is that right?
That's right.
And if we go to the next box under the heading Background and Context, it says the training that is sought is set out there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, was that text designed to set out the training learning objectives?
Yes.
Now, thank you for that. And if bearing in mind that answer, can we now go back to your How Training Works report at LFB 000555127/11 and paragraph 5.1. There you explain that training packages fell into a number of categories: initial acquisition, refresher, and then turning over the page to page 12, confirmation of skills, initial/refresher, assessment, or multi-agency training. Now, looking at those, who decided what category or what type of learning should be developed in response to a particular training request?
Just to clarify, you're talking about the training solution, so ultimately whether it was a computer-based training or practical,
I'm
simulated.
thinking about the objective, so the second
Right.
stage of the ADDIE model at the
Okay,
moment.
so in terms of, so yet again, it would be the commissioning department
Yep.
who would come forward and would say what type of skill, knowledge or behaviour they would like the individual to acquire by the end of that training.
So again, it'd be the commissioning department who decided whether refresher training was needed and what it would cover.
They wouldn't specifically categorise it as that. What they would do is they would come back, as I said, and talk about the types of training, not the skill and the behaviour. Part of the subsequent Tcap process would then be, is this the type of course that needed to have an annual refresh? Did it need to have an assessment? So that wouldn't always have been at the first stage, but ultimately, yes, it was their responsibility.
Looking at the penultimate bullet point here, assessment,
Yep.
how would the LFB decide which courses required assessment as opposed to others?
So in this case, it's predominantly talking about promotion rounds. So this would be for operational staff who are progressing through the various ranks, roles within the organisation. And then there would be a determination whether there'd be a formal assessment or not. That did apply to some of the courses where we talk about annual refresh. So taking, for an example, breathing apparatus, incident command and driving and immediate emergency care. There were refreshers there that were assessed.
And that was without qualification, that was always so?
Yes, if there's something that was set either statutory or it was something that, in the case of the immediate emergency care, that was part of the clinical governance with the London Ambulance Service.
Thank you. Now, I'm now going to move on to stage 3 of the ADDIE model, which is the design and development of the training solutions. And if we go back to your second statement to this inquiry, which is at LFB 00102138/29, and in particular paragraph 49, you describe this stage of the process thus: the commissioning department specified the training content by setting the learning objectives and aims. Babcock proposes and designs the content and training solution to meet these learning objectives. The training content and training solution is approved by the commissioning department. What is the role of your department, or what was the role of your department at that stage of the process?
So once the training had been approved and signed off, then it would be my department's role to sit with Babcock and project manage that, to make sure that there was an end-to-end process, that the timelines were being met. If there were any sort of slippages along the way, then they would be raised by my department at various governance meetings. Ultimately, once the training had been signed off and became part of the training guide, another arm of my department was responsible for liaising with Babcock to make sure that the right people were being trained at the right time, at the right frequency, and performance managed that.
So once developed, your role was ensuring it was delivered, to use that inelegant phrase.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the department, the training department, was really around delivery. Yeah.
Thank you. On that note, if we now go to your Mps statement, which is at MET 0071103/8, and really the final paragraph on that page, here you summarise the design and development stage and the role of the various parties. And you say this: all new training or changes to training is done by the training commissioning out alteration process. A training need will be identified, then the responsibility for that comes to my department. My department will sit down with the commissioning department and establish what they require and what do they need. At that time, we are not looking for a training solution. That is not their focus. What they need to say to my department is that at the end of a chosen intervention, they want a certain amount of people trained in a certain training area. It is not for them to choose the length or venue of the training. It's purely the knowledge requirement, skill requirement, or behavioural change. And my project managers will work with them alongside the designers of Babcock to come up with a training solution. Discussions around practical training, computer-based training, CBT, course duration are then had at this stage. The commissioning department then receive the suggestion and they will sign it off. Babcock advise and find a solution. LFB has responsibility and signs it off. Now, that passage there suggests a more substantive role in collaboration with Babcock. Is that a fair observation to make?
No.
Is it a concentration on delivery that you'd wish to emphasise?
Yeah, I mean, what this process is what I'm trying to describe here is that it's a project management process. So that the department, the individuals within the commissioning team within my department were there to project manage that the various stages of the Tcap process were met.
Understood.
And they were brokering, for want of a better word, between the commissioning departments and Babcock.
Now, you say there, you refer to computer-based training and other practical matters. Who decided the format of a particular training package and when?
Yeah, so ultimately, the training solution, that's Babcock's responsibility to come forward as the training provider to say this is how we think the best way that we can meet that learning objective. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes you will get commissioning departments coming forward saying this is the solution that we want, but it's the training provider's role.
Now, just looking at Babcock's role here, could we go to the witness statement of Assistant Commissioner Graham Ellis? And that can be found at LFB 00118230. And if we go to page 15 within that statement. And you'll see there paragraph 69. And he makes or gives the following evidence regarding Babcock's ability to design and develop training packages. And he says this: from 2012 onwards, many LFB HQ-based operations departments were experiencing additional demands related to the Babcock training contract. These additional demands on officer time arose from the training contractor needing support from LFB subject matter experts to provide expert knowledge and advice. Whilst it would have been reasonable to expect that Babcock training designers may have infrequent requests for detailed information on a specific aspect of policy or procedure, there appeared to be a significant and constant reliance upon LFB SME officers. The demands on LFB resources associated with this were regularly reported to line managers up to director level. And could we then just move down further the page to paragraph 71, where Mr. Ellis said this: it was not uncommon for both the LFB training and development representative, frequently a non-operational FRS staff member, as well as the Babcock training representative at Tcap meetings, to have a limited understanding of the issue at hand, and therefore difficulty in understanding what an effective training product might look like. The reliance on LFB SMEs presented unplanned resource challenges for LFB, and often resulted in training commissioning or training alterations becoming a lengthy, drawn-out process. This meant that it was not always possible to fast-track urgently needed changes into IC, so that's Incident Command training. Well, my question arising out of that is a direct one. Do you agree with Mr. Ellis?
Can I go back to the first paragraph?
Of course,
Because
you've
I've
got the
slightly-
page, paragraph 69.
Yeah. So I think that's a fair statement at the start of the contract. There was definitely a significant draw on the subject matter experts within the LFB. Those subject matter experts would have been the program managers and curriculum managers who delivered the training prior to the outsource. So they were, in effect, there was a transition, and they had a significant amount of experience in that area. I think as time went on, that draw on the resource reduced, but that's a fair statement to make at the start of the contract. It's also a fair statement to say in relation to incident command training for longer. So that would have been a longer draw when it comes to the area of incident command, because the subject matter experts for incident command are limited throughout the UK Fire and Rescue Service. You can call on sort of experts in other arenas, but predominantly those would have been officers within LFB who did work, as I say, in previous training environment. The thing that I challenge here is, I think it was in 71.
Would you like the document to scroll down?
Yes,
Mr. Gross?
please. Yes, so where Mr. Ellis is saying that it was not uncommon for the training representative to have limited understanding of the issue at hand, they wouldn't. They're not an operational member of staff. That wasn't their role. Their role was to collate the information and to project manage the Tcap from end to end. They were not there as a subject matter expert.
Looking at the final sentence of paragraph 71, Mr. Groves,
Yeah.
am I right to assume that is evidence that you wouldn't dispute or put more highly you'd agree with, that it wasn't always possible to fast-track urgently needed changes into IC training.
I agree with that.
And the essential reason for that, on what you've said thus far, is limited resources with a specialism in incident command within the LFB. Is that fair?
Yeah, there's a limited pool to go to. Yeah.
What attempts were made to contact external experts in incident command to get their assistance on training programs related to incident command?
Right, so this is where, so I'll answer that first. So in terms of the LFB offered to second individuals from LFB into Babcock in a purely design and consultancy capacity. That did happen for a short period of time. Group Manager Butler seconded from LFB into Babcock to assist with design. It wasn't the LFB's responsibility to go and find out who the subject matter expert was. We had a period of time where we were trying to make it clear to Babcock it's their responsibility to find the training experts. We can signpost people, but it wasn't our job to make that contact. The reason we did that is we were under scrutiny in the sense of you're outsourcing training, but in effect you're doing a lot of work for the contractor, and in some ways you are paying twice. So you're paying the contractor and then you're still providing some of that service yourself.
So is it right, therefore, to say that the LFB, beyond secondment of Group Manager Butler, did not identify anyone from outside the LFB who might assist in the preparation of, quotes, urgently needed changes to IC training?
I do recall there being some individuals named from the commissioning department which were handed across to Babcock.
But no one from outside the LFB?
Yes, outside of the
outside
LFB. Yeah.
Given what Mr. Ellis says here about urgently needed changes into IC training, did you raise problems about Babcock not doing what the LFB wanted with senior people at Babcock and urge them to remedy matters?
Yes. So,
first of all, who did you contact and when first about this issue?
I can't recall the exact timeline, but I would imagine this was quite early into the contract. I would say about 2014, I think. So I brought this to the attention of my line manager. I also presented information to various committees to say that some training is not progressing as rapidly as perhaps we'd like it to be, and one of those reasons would have been around the subject matter expertise of the individuals that Babcock were using. I can remember a separate discussion with the director and also the commissioner at the time to look at ways that we could get into a charging arrangement with Babcock for our subject matter expertise time. And whilst that was all well and good, that charge didn't necessarily mean that you were going to get the training delivered any quicker, because you were taking people away from other work, which was their day-to-day workload.
Isn't the reality, though, because of the limitations on Babcock's own in-house expertise, that they were always going to be reliant upon you for expert advice, particularly in respect of incident command? And so, in reality, wasn't the burden on you to get someone to assist the execution of urgently needed IC training rather than Babcock, looking at the reality of the situation?
I would say that there were avenues available to Babcock. The UK Fire and Rescue Service is large. They could make links with other fire and rescue services within the country, and ultimately they did that. I think they formed quite a relationship with Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service. As I said earlier, there was, I suppose, pressure on LFB to, it had outsourced a contract and Babcock were there to provide, we wanted them to respond to it, but there came a time when we had to step in and we had to second someone across and we had to start giving them names of individuals.
Because
and there was more.
Apologies for cutting up, but ultimately the responsibility is on LFB to train its officers appropriately, and particularly those who are likely to be in charge of incident and holding incident command responsibility.
Yeah, the risk remains with the LFB, yes.
How long did it take for Babcock to institute its relationship with Hampshire and to get it working so they were getting the knowledge and expertise they required?
I can't answer that, I'm sorry, I don't know. I can't give you a...
Was it some time into the contract, so post-2014, or was it just mindful that you thought these issues started to arise in 2014? Or
yeah, I think it was around 2015. There was an individual who joined Babcock who'd previously worked in Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service. There was a subject matter expert. I can't recall the exact timing, sorry.
Mr. Grove, just help me if you can with this. Were you involved in any of the discussions with Babcock that led to the contract for training, for them to provide training?
I was the project manager. So back from 2009 to 2012, I managed the process from end to end. I didn't sit down and specify what needed to be in that contract.
Well, it may be that Mr. Kinnear is going to come on to this later on, but your answers about Babcock's experience and, if you like, knowledge base in relation to training for incident command is something that might have been investigated in the course of negotiating the contract. Mm-hmm. Do you recall whether that was the case or not?
There were subject matter experts, so as part of that, the procurement process, there were experts from various departments, and there was an expert from the commissioning arm who sat through that process. And there were certain areas that were, I suppose you'd say, were more scrutinised than others, and incident command and BA were predominantly scrutinised as part of their outline solutions and their final solutions.
Well, I ask because I would assume that Babcock would have assured you that they had the resources to provide the training that you wanted.
Yes.
Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so in terms of their submission would have included a training resource model with which would have outlined the number of trainers that they needed to provide with the relevant experience, expertise and qualifications. So that would have been part of their solution.
Right. Thank you very much.
Just flowing on from what the chairman asked, do you think that the training model and Babcock's over-reliance, possibly at the start at least, on LFB subject matter experts hindered or delayed the swift development of training programmes?
I would say at the start of the contract, I mean, it was signed on the 28th of February, and then Babcock were expected to deliver from the 1st of April. I mean, that in my world is just ridiculous. That was never going to be the case. No one could do that. We expected a 12 to 18 month mobilisation period. So you would expect that they would have time, have difficulty mobilising a workforce in a matter of 4 weeks.
So is the answer to my, sorry to interrupt, but is the answer to my question yes? The over-reliance did hinder matters.
Can you ask me your question again, please?
Of course,
sorry.
yeah. Did over-reliance on, or by Babcock, on LFB subject matter experts hinder
Yes.
or delay
implementation
of the training program?
Yes.
And certainly did until, would you say, 18 months into the contract, to the life of the contract?
I would say in certain areas it was longer than that.
And what would those areas be?
So incident command was one of those areas.
Any other matters where delay was as noticeable as incident command?
There were some delays in breathing apparatus and real fire training, but it was predominantly in the area of incident command.
We'll come on to incident command later because obviously it is a particular topic of interest. Could I go back to the Ribbon Star Independent Review, which is at LFB 0006786/33. And it's really observation 9, which you see sits in that blue box in the top third of the page. And it says this: whilst the Tcap process had been necessary to ensure that LFB, as the client, are confident that the provider is delivering training that is appropriate and delivered in a consistent manner, it is viewed by many as a cumbersome process that can lead to significant delays in the design and delivery of new courses. It seems that part of the difficulty is that the driver for such training, be it the creation of a new policy, the alteration of existing policy, or the introduction of new equipment or techniques, is generally developed by a subject matter expert employed by LFB. Following the Tcap process, however, means the associated training package will be designed by the training provider, BTL Babcock, who may not have access to this level of expertise. Now, first of all, do you agree with the criticism that the Tcap process at the time of Grenfell fire was a cumbersome process that could lead to significant delays in design and delivery of new courses?
Yes, but I would also add that there's the way that the LFB operates. There is every 18 months there are promotion rounds, and what you find is that the subject matter experts change. And as a result, that can lead to delays in the process because you've got someone new in a commissioning department in a certain area who then has to get up to speed. So sometimes those promotions did delay the process, but it was definitely seen as a cumbersome process, and that was something that was fed back to me on a regular basis. When I took over from Mr. Hughes, one of the things that was made clear to me by all of my peer heads of service was you need to do something about the Tcap process.
Now, following on from that, was consideration ever given to bringing content design in-house so that effectively the SMEs would be responsible for the design of the training courses in their subject matter area?
Not until the Ribbon Star report. I would say not seriously until the Ribbon Star report. There had been sort of talk about it previously, but nothing was really pursued.
Before the Ribbon Star report was commissioned, did you give any thought to getting an independent consultant in to advise you on what reforms could be made to make the process less cumbersome?
Yes, I did suggest that we, as part of a peer review, we had someone from another a fire service to come in and review it, or I did suggest that we could have someone from the NHS because we had built up a relationship with the Leadership Academy within the NHS.
So who in particular did you raise that suggestion with, and what was their response?
That was raised with both Danny Cotton, Steve Apter. I mean, to be honest with you, it's something that I brought back on more than one occasion. I think it was important for us to have some external scrutiny.
And what were the reasons given by either Danny Cotton, Steve Apter, or any of the others for not having an external individual examine the LFB's internal processes?
I think there was sort of a range. There was like the LGA peer review, so they felt that there was already some review that was already ongoing. There was also talk of the HMI inspections coming, and the belief that that would be addressed as part of that process. And also there was discussions around whether someone would understand the complexity and uniqueness of the London context.
Were you satisfied that they were good responses to the concern you'd raised?
No.
Why? What was deficient about the LGA process, the HMI process, from your perspective?
As someone who had taken part in the LGA process, as someone who's at the end of it and as part of the inspection processes, it's a very short period of time. They come in and do inspections over, a week, a couple of weeks, throughout a whole organisation. So they're only going to spend a very small amount of time with you in the learning and development arena. And I felt that there was a need for us to look at the provision in depth, and also the way that the contract, this is a 25-year contract, and it's going to change. It's going to change, at least every 3 to 5 years. And I thought it was important that not only did we look at the content of the contract, but also the structures within the LFB that served and delivered that. And I felt that as time went on, my department became more of a transactional department and became more and more removed from the actual delivery.
Could I build on what you've just said then? Could we turn to MET 000-79358, which is a statement from Nick Markwell, who I think worked in the training commissioning department within your department between 2012 and 2018.
Yep.
And if we go to page 6 within Mr. Markwell's statement in the second paragraph, he said this: to conclude, at any one time, there was only 3 or 4 of us working on Tcaps. Our workload was very heavy, and I raised this issue with senior management on more than one occasion, as the constant pressure and changing priorities made for a stressful work environment. And if we go to the final sentence of this paragraph, our complaints seem to fall on deaf ears. I don't recall a time when more staff came to help. And then if we can look at the final paragraph on this particular page, he said this: most of my time was spent chasing missing deadlines from Babcock and explaining to commissioning department why they would not get training on time. Did Mr. Markwell raise those concerns with you?
Mr. Markwell did, and his peers raised on a number of occasions that they felt that their workload was a heavy one, and they felt that they needed more resources. It didn't fall on deaf ears. I think for about 3 years in a row, I made growth bids, part of the annual budget process, looking for additional programme managers within that team, and they were rejected.
Were you given a reason as to why those bids were rejected?
No.
Did you ask for a reason?
There was no point. I wouldn't have got one.
Can we go back to your second witness statement?
Mr. Kenny, I've got one eye on the clock. Do you think this might be a convenient point?
I'm heading to finish this page and the next page, which would be a convenient spot, and I'm rather hoping to get it done by 25 to. So it would make for a neater end.
Quite a long morning. Are you happy to keep going?
I'm happy, yeah, to continue.
All right.
Thank you, sir. If we can go to your second witness statement, which is LFB 00102138/22 and paragraph 32. There you explain that once the training requirement was fully specified, Babcock had a good understanding of the Brigade requirement. Babcock would usually produce 3 options for delivery of the training to be considered by the Brigade. Occasionally fewer options were provided by Babcock on agreement with the Brigade. This may happen if the commissioning department in agreement with Babcock had already decided on the best training option. The stakeholder group would then consider the options where applicable and choose their preferred training solution. If this had a cost implication, this was submitted to CPMB for approval. Any cost implications would have been considered against the training requirements and the outcomes set by the commissioning department. Cost and quality were the key factors. Where cost was an issue, a paper was presented to a meeting of the corporate management team with a recommendation for course classes to either be reduced or deferred to the subsequent training year. Cost is not a factor for risk-critical training, and such training would not be reduced or deferred. When might the selection of a training option have, quotes, a cost implication, close quotes?
I can give you an example, or sort of two. One was around the firefighter development programme. There was a change in the leaver rate, so we had to put through a significant amount of new trainees, which meant that flexed the contract past that 20%. So that had a cost implication, and also in later years when the incident command strategy had changed and that we were looking for knowledge-based revalidation assessments, the number of courses and the number of, I suppose, innovations around the incident command curricula increased, meant that it had a higher cost impact. In both cases, we worked through the statement of training requirements to ensure that those pieces of critical training were embedded first, and then you'd look at other pieces of training that could, in effect, either be reduced or deferred.
Now, following on from that, you say cost is not a factor for risk-critical training. Who determined what risk-critical training was?
Okay, so at the start of the contract, so when we handed over all of our information to Babcock, we listed to them what we consider to be the risk-critical training areas. The Director of Operations, we worked with the Director of Operations at the time, and he highlighted the areas that he thought was critical in the sense of keeping the front line serviced, and also that people had the relevant skills to keep themselves safe. That was revisited, those core skills revisited at least on 2 occasions that I can recall.
Thank you. Sir, I've reached the questions I wanted to reach by this time, so
right.
now is an appropriate time for a break, subject to your approval.
Yes, well, I think that's a very good idea. I think it's time we had our morning break, Mr. Groves, so we'll stop there for a few minutes. We'll resume at 11:45, please. And while you're out of the room, I have to ask you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence, and that will be true on other occasions as well.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would you like to go with the usher, please? Thank you. 11:45, please. Would you ask Mr. Groves to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Groves, ready to carry on?
Yes,
Good, thank you. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Groves, can we now turn to stage 4 of the ADDI process, which was implementing the design? And could we go to LFB 00102138/23? And we see in paragraph 33, you describe the transition to stage 4 of the ADDI model, which is, as I say, implementation. And you say in the second line down this, all training materials were signed off by the subject policy advisor from the department commissioning the training, and the training solution would then be piloted. The relevant commissioning department would identify individuals to attend the pilot to ensure effective feedback on the pilot. The attendees would be personnel with knowledge of the subject matter of the pilot. Now, would responsibility for signing off a training package lie solely with the commissioning department?
No, there have been a number of individuals who would sign off the package. Predominantly, it would be the commissioning department in terms of the content, but you'd also have that signed off by Babcock in terms of say that the design element had been completed. You'd have it signed off by the AC fire stations again, or his representative to say that they are happy in terms of the regime, so how it was going to be delivered and didn't have a detrimental impact. And you'd also have it signed off by either myself or a nominated deputy.
Thank you. And would every training course have a pilot?
No.
Which ones would?
Predominantly those with practical elements. CBTs, computer-based training, didn't always have a pilot.
And who would attend the pilot to ensure effective feedback? Would it be operational personnel? Would there be a spread of seniority? Who would attend?
So you'd have the subject matter expert, which predominantly would have been an operational member of staff.
You go on in your witness statement to say at paragraphs 34 and 35 that once the training solution was agreed as meeting the requirements of the Tcap would be closed and signed off by the following people. And I think they're the ones that you've adverted to already: the head of service for the commissioning department, personal development manager, Babcock head of training and design, Babcock head of business support, Brigade training. And then the training solution would then be added to the course guide, or if it was computer-based training package, loaded to Big Learning. First of all, what is Big Learning?
Big Learning is a learning management resource. So in effect, it's a portal on a computer system where all training materials are held. So that could be anything from training guides, training content, and online courses, assessments. All materials are held there.
Who had access to Big Learning?
There are permission levels. So ultimately, everyone who could attend a course had access to Big Learning. But obviously designers, there'd be a certain area for designers which was exclusively permission rights for themselves. Line managers could go in and see how individuals, whether they had completed their training or what stage they were in the process. So it's open virtually to whole organisation, but with different access permissions.
Thank you. And following completion and sign-off of Tcap, how long would it take for the training to be actually rolled out and provided to relevant personnel?
So Tcap couldn't be signed off until a pilot had been concluded. The way that we worked is that you would have a pilot course, and then you would assume that it would be signed off, so those subsequent courses were already scheduled in the next quarter.
Thank you. Can we now go to the final stage, which is stage 5, and that's evaluation of effectiveness? And if we could, for these purposes, turn to your How Training Works report at LFB 0005527/23 and paragraph 7.1, where you say this: the Brigade has robust and effective training quality assurance and evaluation processes of the training delivered via BTL. Through these processes, the Brigade measures BTL's performance and seeks assurance that the training provided fully meets the needs of the organisation. All courses in the annual statement of training requirements are audited separately, at least once a year, by the Brigade and BTL. Now, we have no reports of those audits. So my first question is, did those audits take place at all?
Yes. As it said, each piece of training was audited at least once a year. For some areas, it was audited more than once a year.
What areas would require more than annual audit?
It wasn't specified, so it wasn't laid down that they had to, but by experience, it would have been breathing apparatus, real fire training, immediate emergency care, driving, and incident command. So those areas that were considered to be the 4 key training curricula.
Who was responsible for carrying out that audit function?
So you would have audits undertaken by Babcock trainers and their line managers. On the LFB side, you would have auditors originally that were based within my department. That function was then transferred to the Ops Policy and Assurance department, and you would sometimes, not always, have someone from the commissioning department doing those audits as well.
Was it both the role of LFB and Babcock to audit the content and quality of the training material?
Yes.
And how would the results of the audit be progressed or reviewed higher up the chain?
Yeah, so you'd have, there was a meeting that occurred on a monthly basis between representatives from Babcock audit team and the auditors within the LFB, and they'd look at the feedback. That information was then fed into those monthly project boards I talked about earlier. So that information was available for the project board to see whether there needed to be a change in either the training content or the way that training was delivered.
Thank you. If we can go back to your report, you say in paragraph 7.1, in addition, the majority of BTL-led training delivery is subject to a formal level 1 evaluation. This performance data is reviewed by the Brigade and BTL quality assurance teams, and remedial action is taken to improve areas of identified underperformance. Now, you say there that the majority of BTL-led training delivery is subject to a level 1 evaluation. Why not all training?
You didn't have level 1 evaluations for computer-based training.
Why?
Because the level 1 evaluation focused predominantly on the training venue, the suitability of the venue, focused on the trainer experience, the trainer's credibility, how they reacted to the delegates, etc. And that wasn't, you couldn't do that.
It just wasn't applicable.
No.
Can we now look, and we've touched on this earlier, the LFB's dynamic and intelligent operational training, so that's the DIOT policy. That can be found at LFB at *005 171. And if we go to page 13. And if we look at paragraph 6.10 within the glossary, and it defines levels 1, 2, 3 and 4, we see there that level 1 questionnaires consider the candidate's reactions to and the opinions of the course. They're normally completed at the end of the course via the automated course evaluation management system. And that's level 1 that's been referred to in your statement.
Yes.
And the report. Level 1, from the face of it, is unlikely to give objective insights into the quality and efficacy of the training. Would that be a fair observation of its limitations?
There is an element within that form where the delegates are asked in free text to provide feedback in terms of their experience of the course, the trainer, etc. So there is the potential for them to do that.
There's something anyway.
There is.
If we can look at the other levels, we've got level 2, 3 and 4 set out there. Can you help us? Which training courses would attract a level 3 or a level 4 evaluation?
There were no courses that had a level 3 evaluation.
And why was that?
Because the organisation hadn't pursued a level 3 strategy. It focused predominantly on level 1 and level 2. Level 3 was being addressed in terms of at the workplace. So rather than it having a formal evaluation process, what you would have is the line managers would look at an individual's performance, and then you would have, I'll give you an example. So say someone had been on a breathing apparatus course, and the line manager would get a copy of the report to see how that individual had performed in the training. If there was an area where they felt that there was an identified need, then that individual would be tagged. Then there would be issued a personal development record. It would be agreed how that individual needed to improve, what areas that there was need to be improved, and it could ultimately be a return to a course. As part of that process, you would also, it was the line manager's responsibility. So say you had 6 people within your watch who'd been on a course over a period of time, and say you had 4 people who had reported back a negative component, it was their responsibility to let the commissioning department and the training department know, which is then fed into the performance, so those project boards.
Thank you.
There wasn't a formal level 3 process.
Looking at level 4,
Yep.
how often were level 4 evaluations carried out, and in relation to what areas of training?
That there was no level 4 formal process.
So level 3 and 4 are essentially redundant.
Yes.
Can we turn back to how training works report, and at page 23, so that's at LFB LFB 000555127/23, which are on there. You set out other evaluation tools deployed by the Brigade, and I don't want to go through each and every one of them, but in summary you refer, I think, to 3 processes. First, station managers using the Brigade standard service standards to check the performance of staff. Secondly, quality assurance of those checks by operational assurance officers. And thirdly, the use of a computer-based quiz to test individuals on their knowledge of operational subjects. Is that a fair and accurate summary?
It is.
Would you accept that none of those processes evaluates the content, quality or efficacy of Babcock's training packages?
No, I would say when you, if you're looking at a practical skill, then if a watch manager or station manager observes that there are repeated areas where someone isn't performing to the required standard, then that is a reflection on the training that's being delivered. So I would say that it does address that.
But I suppose putting the question slightly differently,
Yeah.
Was there a framework by which these processes evaluated the rigorous and systemic view of content, quality and efficacy of the training packages?
So the service standard audits are where the auditors would observe a particular drill or exercise, and they would identify trends, and then those trends would be fed into the ODCB and ultimately the Operational Professionalism Board. So that became as a standard report that was considered by those boards.
Looking at what you've set out there in describing the processes, none seems to evaluate the performance of LFB staff as against specific learning outcomes. Is that a fair criticism?
That is a fair criticism.
So is it also fair to say that once a training package had been developed by Babcock, signed off by the commissioning department, it was assumed to be fit for purpose?
Yes.
So what type of event or decision would be required to alter that assumption that the package was fit for purpose?
So you had, as I said, you'd get feedback from delegates, whether that be through the level 1 or level 2 process. You get information back through the incident management database, so you could get some trends there. You'd also get some trends maybe in terms of things like the safety event recording database. So there's a number of areas where you could see what the trends were, and they were fed back into that ODCB or the OPB meeting.
And so with the sole exception of computer-based training, is it right to say that the main framework or the principal evaluative tool was actually the ODCB in looking at the sort of quality and effectiveness of training packages?
So you had, the ODCB was more about strategic direction and analysing needs and saying these are the areas in which training needs to be commissioned. The true analysis in terms of the training content and whether it's still fit for purpose was done either through those project boards, as I say, which are on a monthly basis, and at least every 3 years as part of that course review cycle. Now,
We'll come on to that course review cycle in due course. And indeed, it's probably the most useful subject to turn to now. Can we go to page 24 of your How Training Works report? And you see towards the bottom of the page is the emboldened heading continuous improvement. And below that, paragraph 9.1 says this: all courses within the training contract are subject to a continuous process of course review. The focus, scope and timeframe for course reviews are determined in partnership between the Brigade and BTL. Now, bearing in mind that phrase, continuous process of course review, can we look at your second witness statement, which is at LFB 00102138/16. And if we look at paragraph 19 in particular, where you set out there the quotation in italics, this course review process, Babcock have committed to a review of all of the current training courses within the first 3 years of the contract. So picking up the phrase you used in an earlier answer. Now, is that course review by Babcock the self-same thing as the continuous process of course review that you refer to in the How Training Works?
it's the same thing.
Exactly the same.
Yeah.
So if Bob Babcock's review were to be undertaken within the first 3 years of the contract, that process would be completed by April 2015, presumably.
Yes.
Was there any variation to that date?
Yes.
To when and in what respects?
So in the first 18 months of the contract, no course reviews had been undertaken.
And why was that?
There was a disagreement between the LFB and Babcock about what constituted, what the component parts of that review would be.
When you say component parts, the subject area, so like incident command or whatever?
No, more about what the actual analysis of that review would be and who would do what roles and responsibilities.
So by the contractually agreed deadline of April 2015, what had been done in terms of review of training?
If my memory serves me correct, I believe that there were course reviews for driving, BA, incident command, and immediate emergency care, I believe, for the first. I think those 4 key areas were done. It's a bit hard for me because I wasn't responsible for that at the time, but I'm pretty sure that was the case.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we can go to an exhibit that you provide, which is PG14, which can be found at LFB 00102201, hopefully we find a sort of a pictogram headed Babcock Initial Course Review Process. And if that could be expanded. Now, is that the process that's otherwise known by the initials ICRP, or confusingly IPCR?
Yes.
And was the intention underpinning the 3-year course review that all courses would be comprehensively reviewed and, if necessary, amended?
All training curricula were reviewed within the 3 years. I think there was a slight misunderstanding. Not every single course was reviewed in detail. So what they would do is they would take a training curricula. So incident command would be an example of that. And then they would look at all of the courses beneath that, and then would look at feedback that they had received or areas in which they felt that they could make an improvement. And they would come forward and say, these are the courses within that particular training curricula that we think needs to be focused on.
What criteria would determine the depth of the review? Would it be the risk that was attendant upon the activity, such as incident command, or what other factors would determine intensity?
Yeah. So going back to my earlier sort of answer around the core skills courses, so those areas that were considered to be the essential areas for a firefighter in the front line, those were the areas that were had a deep dive rather than other areas. Give you an example, things like IT or personal skills. Those they weren't subjected to such a deep dive.
Is there, looking at it, the practicalities of the review, did it amount to Babcock effectively marking its own homework by reviewing the content and quality of its courses?
Yes.
Would it have been more appropriate for the LFB, or indeed an external body, to have undertaken the review process?
External body, yes.
Did you ever suggest that at the time?
No.
Did you express any concerns that Babcock was effectively marking its own homework, and how best to remedy that problem?
I recall mentioning that to Robert Scott as part of the ribboned report.
And he was the author, I think, of that report, wasn't he?
Yes.
And so was it a concern that struck you after the fire, or was it a concern that predated the fire?
It was something that struck me post the fire, the reason being the the course review process hadn't really been embedded at that point. Whilst there had been those initial reports with a whole series of recommendations, it wasn't until later that you actually saw products being delivered.
Understood. Can we go back to your second inquiry witness statement, which is at LFB 00102138/18 and paragraph 21? You set out there 14 skill areas. I think they're the ones you touched on in an earlier answer. Those are the skill areas that you were referring to.
Yes.
And if we look at the fourth bullet point down, it refers to incident management training. Is that the same as incident command training?
It is.
Were you personally or your department involved in the review of that subject area?
The wider department, yes. At that time, I wasn't responsible for training commissioning. That come later, but the department certainly was, yes.
Now, if we can look at paragraph 25 of your second inquiry statement, which requires us to turn to page 20, you say there that all training materials, including trainer guides, timetables and presentations, would be considered in the course review alongside delegate feedback. Materials considered are detailed in the course review report for each skill report. Recommendations would be considered at the course review board, and any recommendations taken forward would be through a Tcap and governed and assured through the Tcap. As part of the course review, Babcock made recommendations to the Brigade Course Review Board, albeit it was the Brigade's decision as to any changes made to courses. And so the upshot of that is that the findings of the 3-year course review process were actioned via the Tcap process and via Tcap forms. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, it appears that all of the LFB's evaluation processes related to assessing existing training material on what we've seen thus far. Is that a fair view to take?
As part of the course review process?
Yes. And there was no process by which the training department took the step back and asked what might be missing from that programme which needed to be addressed?
No.
Was that omission noted by you or anyone else at the time?
No.
That is a marked deficiency in the effectiveness of the review programme, isn't it?
Yes.
Could we turn now to a separate and distinct topic, which is local training? And what I'd like to start with here is what you describe the process as being in your How Training Works report, which is at LFB 000555127/15 and paragraph 6.1. Now, what you say here is this: in addition to training delivered via the Brigade BTL contract, workplace training is delivered at fire stations as part of the Developing and Maintaining Operational Professionalism, DAMOP, requirements, best practice assessments, borough training plans, and revalidation of incident command. Now, having set that context, can we look at the DAMOP process itself? And the starting point is the policy which you exhibit to your statement as PG3, and that can be found at LFB 000555129. Okay, the date of that iteration of the policies 2006 and reviewed in September 2016. And if we go to the introduction on page 2, paragraph 1.1. This summarises the policy thus: the authority has a statutory duty to ensure that operational staff are trained to do their job effectively and safely. 1.2. To achieve this, training is provided in various forms to equip staff with the necessary skills, knowledge and understanding to carry out their role to the required standards. Initially, training for firefighters is provided by our training provider, and subsequently most development and maintenance of skills will be carried out at station. 1.3. Once the initial learning phase has taken place, it will be necessary for staff to practice their newfound skills, knowledge and understanding in conjunction with and in addition to their existing skills, knowledge and understanding. 1.4. This practice is what is referred to as station-based continuation training, and this training note, in conjunction with the guidance, sets out what is required to enable staff at stations to maintain their professionalism and competence by continually developing their skills, knowledge and understanding. What processes or arrangements did your department have to ensure that station-based training mirrored and accurately enhanced Babcock's own training?
So, sorry, can I just go back and just want to confirm? So this is up to the point of the fire, yes?
Yes.
None.
Why were no such arrangements in place?
Because the responsibility for local training at that point sat with the head of fire stations. It did not sit with the training department.
So your department had no such arrangements. Did the head of fire services departments have arrangements to ensure consistency of station-based training with that provided by Babcock?
I don't know. I couldn't answer that. I think that's one for a colleague. But what I can say is that a number of the computer-based training packages that were produced were used as part of the DAMOP process.
Mr. Groves, it is a question and is a point for you, though, to answer, isn't it? Given your responsibilities in charge of training, there's a risk that if Babcock centrally provided training is not accurately reflected in station-based training, there's a risk of injury and harm flowing from that. Would you accept that?
Yes.
Given that, would you accept that that risk of injury or harm or anything else is an obvious risk, given the absence of any arrangements to check what is being trained out via the station?
I would say yes. That's why, as part of the People Services Review, the function was changed and moved across to the training department. There was a corporate project to actually look at the whole DAMOP process.
But before 2018,
Yeah.
no one had thought how best to eliminate or mitigate the risk of an inconsistency between Babcock training and station-based training. Is that right?
From asking me that question, I would say no. I don't know whether a colleague in fire stations had considered that.
But from your perspective, the
Yes.
answer is no.
Yes.
And certainly you're not aware of any such arrangements to eliminate or mitigate the risk that have been put in place by the Fire Services Department.
No.
Could we turn to page 3 of the policy and section 4, which is headed "What training needs to be done at station level?" Now, over the next few pages, under section 4, the policy sets out under various bold headings a list of key areas of training. We can see core risk, critical skills, specialist skills and knowledge. And if we can turn over the page to page 4, we see procedures, core risk, critical personal skills, physical training, etc. Going through, even on a skim read, that policy, how would a crew manager, a watch manager, or indeed a station manager identify what they need to train their firefighters on?
So I believe that the process is, so there's a borough training plan. So that's one area in which that the training need is identified in terms of what is the local area, in terms of what are the risks in your local area. And in terms of those risks, what regular drills and exercises need to be completed to enable individuals to perform safely. There is also best practice assessments, which are routine drills and exercises to ensure that individuals maintain their skills. There would have been computer-based training and other training that was identified as part of operational news. So there was a range of areas in terms of that would enable a crew manager, watch manager and station manager to look at these are the type of things that you need to be considering for your local borough training plan.
There's nothing in the DAMOP policy to give the station manager that assistance, is there?
No, that's a separate policy.
Before we leave the DAMOP policy, can we turn to page 5 and section 5, so just over the page? And there's a heading, how much training needs to be done, at the very top. And paragraph 5.1 says from the second line down, it has been determined that on average, station-based personnel need to train for approximately 6 hours per tour in order to maintain competence in the core risk critical skills and associated knowledge together with practice in the implementation of operational procedures. 5.2, it is recommended that approximately half, so 3 hours, is programmed for core risk critical training, the remaining time being used to address individual and or team needs and any other training necessary to prepare for incidents relating to risk on that station ground. Now, by my creaky maths, that works out as approximately 6 hours of training for every 48 hours of working. Is that right?
Yes.
Would those 6 hours include time spent on Babcock's computer-based training packages?
The original 6 hours was determined by a corporate project, and at the time that corporate project determined those 6 hours, I'm pretty sure that the CBT packages were not part of those 6 hours.
Were not?
Yeah.
What about training associated with operational news?
This 6 hours would have been before the operational news had been.
So what systems would the LFB, so whether your department or the Fire Services Department, have in place for ensuring that required training was actually being provided at station level?
Yeah. So at this time, at the time of the fire, there would have been a group of officers. I think they were known as training review implementation officers, affectionately known as trios. And I think they went out and did routine inspections to see whether drills and exercises were being completed, and they would scrutinise station training records.
Would they look at adequacy as well as the fact that training was done?
I would say yes, because there was feedback from trios that would be discussed as part of those project boards. So yes, they would have done that.
And if we can go back to your How Training Works report, so LFB 0005527/20 and paragraph 6.12, you say this BTL support the Brigade in the design and development of training materials, accessible online CBTs, to support the delivery of workplace-based training through the DAMOP process. So just so that I've got this clear, is it right that this is a relatively recent development and that at the time of the fire, Babcock were not involved in the preparation of DAMOP training materials?
I'm 95% sure that that is the case.
Thank you. Now can I turn to a separate topic, which is borough training plans, which is something you referred to in earlier answers. And again, can we go to page 21 of your How Training Works report, so it's just over the page, and look at paragraph 6.17, where you describe the role and process of borough training plans in the following way. A borough training plan is developed which identifies training needs through assessing local risks and determines what and how training needs to be provided to mitigate these risks. A training risk matrix contained within Policy Note 698, Borough Training Plan, provides a mechanism to analyse and assess the risk and identify what additional training is required at borough level. Now, helpfully you exhibit the borough training policy, and it's at PG4. And can I first take you to a version which predated the Grenfell fire, and that can be found at LFB 000060216. And if we can turn to page 2 and the introduction at paragraph 1.2, which says, at station and borough level, there are a number of local risks that require a risk assessment to determine what training is required by station-based staff to be best prepared to deal with these risks. The purpose of the borough training plan is to provide a method to help borough commanders identify local training needs through assessing local risks and then determine the training required to address them. The use of the training risk matrix, Appendix 2, will also inform borough commanders of what further resources are required to assist in borough training. Now, the first question that arises from that is this: were borough training plans the sole means by which crew managers, watch managers, station managers determined the station-based training to be provided to their crews?
I can't answer that. I wasn't responsible for that. It was a fire station lead, so it's the head of fire stations. So I think that's best directed to, I'd say, Mr. Brown.
Do you have any knowledge of the subject?
No, this is only now becoming part of the training department remit. So at the point I left, there were discussions about borough training plans becoming the responsibility of the training department.
Just following on from that, given that division of responsibility, to what extent, if at all, did the training department assist borough commanders in assessing training needs in their boroughs?
None.
None. That fell squarely within fire services, did it?
Yes.
And so Mr. Brown is the man to answer those questions. Could we turn to page 5 of this policy? And we see there in the top half of the page a table which sets out the various forms of training that can be provided. And if we look at the bottom row, we see that the letters ICE, ICE, or Instant Command Exercise. Would you agree, and just to ensure that I haven't missed anything, that there's no reference there to either command decision exercises or tactical decision exercises?
I'd agree with you. That doesn't seem that's not referenced there.
Can you help me? What is the difference between incident command exercise, a command decision exercise, and a tactical decision exercise?
I can't help you, I'm afraid. I'd have to be an operational colleague.
Can you help us as to which individual or department would have been responsible for provision of training on those matters? Would it be fire services again?
So in terms of anything incident command related at the time would have been the responsibility of the incident command policy team, which sat within the operational. I can't remember what it was called at the time. It's now Ops Policy and Assurance, but whatever that.
Is it? I think we have
Mr. Ellis. Mr.
Operational
Ellis led
Assurance.
that team.
Was it the one that was headed by Danny Cotton?
Yes.
And can you help us? And please say so if you can't, do incident command exercises, command decision and tactical decision exercises, are they different to local exercises?
An incident command exercise is something that's done as part of a promotion round. So it's usually, so if an individual is going through a promotion round, they need to pass an incident command exercise to prove that they are fit for purpose, for want of a better word. In terms of the CDEs and TDEs, I can't help you with that, I'm afraid.
Now, we see the middle column of this table deals with the frequency of the training activities. And just skim reading that column, you can see that many of the activities don't have a specified frequency, instead are determined by the relevant assessment of risk by that borough. Mm-hmm. Who would be responsible for setting the number and frequencies of training activities in the governed area? Would it be the borough commander?
I would imagine that it's part of the annual. I would say all of the deputy assistant commissioners within the fire service stations department would have got together annually and would determine which things need to be done across the board.
So area DACs.
Yes, sorry, and that was part of the Back to Basics programme.
We'll come on to elements of that in due course.
Okay.
And so would the area DACs also be responsible for planning and designing the substance of station-based training?
No, that would predominantly be the responsibility of the borough commander and the station manager.
Okay. And again, is it right to say that the training department provided no assistance to stations on the substance of the training they provided?
That's correct.
Did you have any role in ensuring that a sufficient amount of training was being undertaken locally,
No.
whether in terms of advice or audit?
No.
Again, would that be something which lay with fire services?
Yes.
Can we now turn over the page to, or the page immediately to next is page 6 and paragraph 7.2 and 7.3. And we see that at the bottom of page 6 under the heading Action Plans, and 7.2 says this: a gap analysis should be carried out by borough commanders using the information on the training risk matrix to identify if all training solutions applicable to the risk can be provided and resourced. If borough commanders identify gaps in training provision or are unable to resource training solutions, these deficiencies are to be discussed in the first instance with the area trio, who will provide advice and guidance, and if appropriate, liaise with central operations and training departments to provide the necessary training requirement. Well, helpfully you've explained what a trio is before, so thank you for that. But what training or assistance did borough commanders themselves receive from you or anyone else to assist them in evaluating training and conducting gap analyses?
So at that time, I believe there wasn't any assistance provided from the training department previous to that. So when the LFB delivered the training.
So pre-2012.
Yeah, there was a course which was a basic training skills module, and there was an advanced training skills module. Those were not commissioned or required as part of the annual training requirement. That has changed subsequently since the incident.
Did you receive any complaints or representations about the absence of that course after 2012?
No.
Do you know how often borough commanders through the area trio liaised with the training department to identify resource problems or seek advice on gaps?
There were, from recollection, the discussions were predominantly around lack of training resources equipment. I'm thinking specifically around things like training foam and scrap cars. That was where the training department became involved.
So the wherewithal to conduct training as opposed to content of courses.
Yeah.
Was it something that you considered whether your department could give more focused assistance to borough commanders to help them do the job of training that they were required to do?
Yes, I think it's come back to my earlier point when I said I felt like the department was becoming more and more transactional rather than a learning and development professional service. Yeah.
Now, given that a lot of the work was done via area trios.
Sorry, can I just? I
Sorry,
feel like
yes.
I need to say something.
Please do.
So, in terms of when the contract was awarded, one of the things that was clear was that the LFB was not to have its own training department. It was not to deliver training. That's what the outsource provision was for. So the department that was set up, which was split between training assurance and that commissioning team, was about supporting the function and having the governance and structures in place. All of the learning and development expertise was considered to be part of that Babcock contract. That's why I'm saying that I felt that the department became more of a contractual, transactional, rather than a learning and development department. But I do know now that there is an external consultant who is looking at the department and what it provides with a means to bring all of that into one place, potentially.
Understood. Taking the step back, bearing in mind the evidence you've given in respect to the role of the area trios,
Yeah.
is it fair to say that, at least in relation to the borough training plans, there was no independent audit process of their adequacy or fitness for purpose, whichever description is used?
I thought that was part of the role of the trio, to be honest with you.
I suppose the emphasis is on the word independent.
Oh, I see what you mean. No, not that I'm aware of. Mr. Brown might say different, but not that I'm aware of.
From your perspective, anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can we now come on to a separate and distinct topic, which is how you train the trainers? And if we can go as our starting point to the Ribbon Star report again, which we can find at LFB 0006776/19. And we see there at the very top of the page, next to paragraph 4.7, the title, Watch Officer Preparedness. And then if we can zoom out and go to the bottom, we see a red and grey box at the bottom of the page. And that sets out the recommendation. And it says this: providing all watch-based officers with some formal instruction on how to deliver a lecture, conduct station-based training, oversee a drill or fireground scenario will improve their ability to carry out their role within the station. Now, given that station-based managers had received no guidance on the most basic of training tasks, on what basis were trainers deemed fit by the LFB to train others?
I wouldn't call these trainers, so they're facilitating a process. But there wasn't, as I said, there wasn't that basic training skills module available to them. There was previously a course that was the line manager as coach and trainer and mentor that wasn't commissioned or added to the training requirement. So there was limited, there wasn't a formal course, and I would imagine that it would be through coaching and mentoring from those who had previously been trainers.
Could I just pick you up on one point? You said that they're essentially facilitators, but just looking at the recommendation there in the first paragraph, it does use the word conduct station-based training.
Yep.
They were trainers. And
Facilitate. I'm sorry. I would say not. They're facilitating the station exercise. This is work that they do day in, day out. So this is a normal drill and exercise, and they would be observing that and seeing whether, for want of a better word, an example, like if a ladder was being pitched correctly, that's something that would be their bread and butter. I don't think that's a training function or responsibility. I can see what is being recommended here, and I do support that and agree that, but I wouldn't have said that they were trainers.
But nonetheless, there was no formal arrangement in place to ensure that they'd met a particular standard of fitness or competence to provide training or facilitate provision of training.
Yeah, there wasn't. No.
Now, given that the LFB scrutinises the competency and performance of Babcock trainers, why wasn't that same process adopted, or a similar process, in relation to trainers or facilitators within the LFB itself?
That goes back to my point earlier that the LFB doesn't have a training department. Its training department is, in effect, Babcock. What we're talking about here is I repeat my word about facilitating an exercise, a drill. But as time moved on, then it was identified here as part of this report, and there was a first-line leadership course that was introduced, which took the individual back to a point where they needed the basics in terms of how you would oversee a drill, how you would conduct that, how you would provide feedback. So, yes, that was missing, and it needed to be addressed. I think what this shows is that there was a process known as the Integrated Personal Development System. And part of that system, which dates back to before the contract was awarded, there were a number of statutory examinations which individuals had to undertake as part of their career, operational personnel. And one of those qualifications was being able to design, develop, deliver training. All of those statutory examinations were disbanded as part of the IPDS system. And I think as time has gone on, it's proven that some of the technical knowledge, whether that is operational or learning and development, has been lost. And there's an understanding that those technical knowledge, whether it's operational or learning and development, needs to be reintroduced, which is why you're getting things like assessment centres, revalidation of incident command, the first line leadership course. Those are all being reinstated. So you've lost some element of that technical competence and experience.
Thank you, Mr. Groves. Now, I'm going to move on to a separate topic now, which is one that has been flagged up in earlier questions, and that concerns the training in response to the recommendations made by the coroner following the Lacknell inquest in relation to incident command. Mr. Groves, I don't want to stop you answering in full.
Sorry.
However, I'd be very grateful if you felt able to do so, to give more concise answers.
Sure.
But I recognise that sometimes context is all important. Now, on that note, following the conclusion of the Lacknell House inquest in March 2013, the coroner sent the LFB what was then known as a Rule 43 letter, which contained her recommendations for reducing the risk of future deaths. Now, that letter we can find at LFB 000 32158. And we see there the letter addressed to the then Fire Commissioner. And if we can turn to the top of page 3, we can see the coroner's recommendation that the LFB consider reviewing its policies on the number of incident commands at an incident, and also that the LFB consider providing additional training to incident commanders. And it said there at the top of the page, it is also recommended that consideration be given to training of ICs and potential ICs to enhance their performance in relation to the following. And I'll read these out for the sake of completeness. Use of the dynamic risk management model and other management tools to enable ICs to analyse a situation and to recognise and react quickly to changing circumstances, to recognise when to escalate attendance by more experienced ICs, to anticipate that a fire might behave in a manner inconsistent with the compartmentation principle, to be aware of the risks to those above and adjacent to the fire flat, handover from one IC to the next, an effective deployment of outgoing ICs, the collection of information from all possible sources, use of methodical search patterns. Now, the LFB's response to the coroner's letter is at LFB 000 42089. Dated the 23rd of May 2013, and if we can go to page 6 and the second paragraph on that page. If that could be expanded, please. This sets out the response to the Incident Command Training recommendation, and the response said this: the Brigade will engage with its training contractor to ensure that the 7 points identified in this recommendation are embedded within the current Incident Command training. The Brigade will ensure that these issues are further considered as part of the current review process of Incident Command training, which is being undertaken with the Brigade's training contractor. This work will aim to ensure that the training provided enhances performance across the range of required skills and knowledge needed to support effective incident command. Now, just looking at the process, is the reference to the current review process of incident command training, which has been undertaken with the Brigade's training contractor, a reference to the Babcock initial course review process that we discussed earlier?
I would say yes.
And you're not aware of any other separate process?
Not that I'm aware of, no. This was before my time, but I would imagine that's the case.
Now, earlier in your evidence, we discussed Mr. Ellis's criticisms of Babcock's heavy reliance on LFB's subject matter experts. Mm-hmm. In light of that criticism and the evidence you have given about the slow start and workup, particularly in relation to incident command, are you able to help us as to why Babcock were asked to review the incident command training so as to check its conformity with the coroner's recommendations and not any other body?
Well, as the training provider, then I think it was right and proper that they would be asked to consider the content of the training curriculum and what was being provided at that time. I'm not saying that should be exclusively, but they should have been involved in that, yes.
Picking up on that word exclusively, do you know whether any consideration was given to undertaking the review required by the coroner internally within the LFB in relation to incident command?
I don't know. I don't know.
When you assumed your senior positions in the training department, is it right to say that there was no existing process which was reviewing the quality of incident command training beyond the Babcock process?
Beyond the Babcock, none that I'm aware of.
By what means did the LFB have oversight of or involvement in Babcock's review of incident command training as required by the Rule 43 letter?
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm giving you a bit of a cop-out here, but I don't know. I wasn't in a role that was involved in the sort of commissioning at that point, so I can't answer that, I'm afraid.
Can we go to and see what assistance you can provide in relation to this document? It's LFB 000-38170, and it's Tcap number 0124, and it's something we touched on earlier on, the subject matter we touched on earlier on, and it's entitled Enhanced Incident Command Training Based on Lacknell Inquest Rule 43 Recommendations. And first of all, have you seen this document before?
I have, yes.
Now, I think just to be clear, the document on your screen at the moment is not in fact the Tcap form, but is a proposal written under Tcap 0124. Is that correct?
I think so.
Now, was Tcap 0124 the means by which Babcock were instructed to undertake the review of incident command training for the purposes of the coroner's recommendations?
Yes, it looks that way, yes.
Now, the opening paragraph says that it's a review of the current incident management training provision directly relating to the areas identified by the 7 Rule 43 recommendations has been undertaken. The purpose of the review was to confirm current practice and to identify areas for improvement to meet the requirements of Tcap 0124. And then the review considered the following incident management courses, and we see a list of 9 covering crew managers up to DAC level. And then if we can look at the final paragraph on this page, it says there, the following table gives a broad overview of the outcomes from the review process in terms of the areas identified for improvement and the proposed solutions to enhance training. And if we can look at this table, the left-hand column identifies different aspects of the LFB's incident command training, and then moving rightwards, the column set out Babcock's findings, action taken and outcome. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if we look as means of an example, the first left-hand column deals with learning outcomes, and reading across, Babcock's conclusion was that, quotes, existing learning outcomes are in need of revision to ensure the training is tightly focused and addresses the outcomes required for each Rule 43 recommendation. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we can turn over the page to the second row, we can see that the first column relates to training provision.
Mm-hmm.
And then Babcock's findings there were, and I quote, existing training provision was either explicit or implicate, I think it means implicit there,
Yeah.
across the different roles. Some received dedicated theory and practical training. For other roles, it depended on the exercise scenario they are exposed to as part of the training as to whether or not all areas relating to the Rule 43 recommendations were covered and assessed. And then if we look at the row immediately below, is concerned with exercise scenarios, Babcock's findings were, as mentioned above, existing exercise scenarios were found to be in need of revision to meet all areas of the Rule 43 recommendations. And if we move to the next column to the right, it detailed action taken. We see the following update, and I quote, suitable exercise scenarios have been identified and Coran's supplementary injects written, aligned to each role and covering the identified LFB policies and procedural notes to ensure delegates' knowledge, understanding and ability is tested by application in addressing the incident command challenges posed by each of the exercise scenarios. Now, apologies for having to listen to me for a prolonged period of time, but can I draw some of these various strands together and see whether I've summarised it correctly, and please say if I haven't. Babcock reviewed the instant command training against the coroner's seven recommendations. Is that right?
Yes.
Babcock found that while the content of the recommendations could be said to be contained within the instant command trainings, it was sometimes implicit or not tightly focused. Would you accept that?
Yes.
And that whether any given individual received the relevant training depended both on rank and the exercise scenarios they happened to be exposed to as part of their training.
Yes.
Would you accept those as a fair threefold summary?
Yes.
Now, could I now look at the covering email that under which the proposal was sent? And that can be found at LFB 00115289. And if that could be expanded. We see it's an email from Doug Massey of Babcock, sent on the 19th of September 2013, so some 6 months after the recommendations were published, to Stephen Green, who I think worked in the Learning and Development Strategy team. Is that right?
He did, yes.
Now, rather than listening to me read something out, which is painful for everyone, I'll invite you to read that to yourself, Mr. Groves. Thank you, Mr. Groves. First question is, what was a Minerva-type exercise?
I believe it's a simulated computer-generated exercise, but I'm not the expert on that. I think it would have to be one of my operational colleagues who would advise you on that.
Now, Doug Massey referred to developing, quotes, a sufficient number of exercise scenarios, close quotes, with 16 having already been identified to start with. Now, how many command decision exercises, or CDEs as they're referred to in this email, did Babcock or the LFB envisage creating in response to the coroner's recommendations?
I can't answer that. I wasn't involved at the time.
Now, if we can look at how this programme was implemented and what factors informed it, and what I want to turn to next is the development of the command decision exercise, and in particular the Holcroft House exercise. And first of all, can we start with the Tcap form, which is at LFB 003716? There we go. And if we could turn to page 8 in this document. And if we could look at the box at the bottom of the page. It records the decision to development command decision exercises and is headed note of any key decisions made, issues raised, etc. And if we look at the first paragraph, it makes reference to the Babcock proposal document we looked at earlier. And it goes on in the second paragraph to say this: superseding Babcock's proposal in stage 3 below, it was not manageable to split this into separate Tcaps for each instant command course, as the proposal is to change and enhance 6 command decision exercises that will be used in all instant command courses. The deadline of 20th December 2013 and current, and stands for the enhancement of 6 CDEs. Following this Tcap, recommendations will be made for further enhancements that will be fed into the IC course review. Now, the first question is an obvious one. Why was the number of CDEs reduced from the anticipated number of 16 or more down to 6?
As I say, I can't answer that. It would have to be colleagues in commissioning department at the time in OPA, or Mr. Hughes, who was responsible for commissioning. I wasn't involved in the process at that time.
Now, the next block of text in that box appears to have been added over a year later.
Right.
And starting from the penultimate line on this page, it reads, following a meeting at Beckton Training Centre on the 10th of December 2014, regarding the enhanced incident command training based on Lacknell inquests, Rule 43 recommendations, the following points were agreed. And if we go over the page, the high-rise building within the initial demonstration was not felt to be suitable by the LFB as the main CDE to address the objectives of Tcap 124. This is now being changed to a CDE currently held by Babcock, known as Blackwall Tower. In addition to this, DAC Graham Ellis felt that there was an opportunity to use a recent incident within a high-rise block which had similarities to Lacknell House as a CDE. Now, looking at the position as at December 2014, there appears to be just one main CDE. Is that a fair reading of that document?
That's how I would read that, yes.
And that was initially intended to be Blackwall Tower CDE.
It looks that way, yes.
Are you able to help us as to whether a decision had been taken just to use one command decision exercise, or was there to be one main one supported by 5 supplemental ones to make the total of 6?
I'm sorry, I can't. No.
Are you able to give us any help, bearing in mind your later knowledge, as to whether the suggested CDE was Holcroft House or some other incident?
I believe that Holcroft House was the scenario that was used rather than Blackwall Tower. I certainly remember that once I became involved, that Holcroft House was the scenario that was referred to.
Can you help us as to why Lacknell itself wasn't used as a CDE?
No, sorry.
Can I now go briefly to an internal Babcock email, which can be found at LFB 000 33013. And if we see there an email at the top of the page from Ragbir Naresh to David Langridge, dated the 5th of December 2013, in which we see a Babcock training designer stating this: my main concern with all of this is that the deadline still stands for Tcap 0124, and we have promised the LFB that we would have 6 CDEs completed. After talking to Doug, so that'd be Doug Massey, my understanding is that the LFB require changes to accept Victoria View. If this is the case, would we be better working on this and submitting the single CDE, or 2 at the most, i.e. Victoria View and Blackwall Tower, on the 20th of December? Now, bearing in mind your later knowledge, and having regard to what's set out in that email, to what extent was the decision to reduce the number of CDEs driven by Babcock's inability to meet the LFB's deadline of the 20th of December?
I don't know is the honest answer to that.
Thank you. So we are 1 minute before 1.
Well, never mind.
And
Convenient point, we'll stop there.
thank you, sir.
Yes, well, Mr. Groves, we're going to have a break now for some lunch. So we'll stop. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And while you're out of the room, I must remind you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right?
Okay.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. 2 o'clock,
Yes,
please.
sir.